Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Mukhaṁ karoti vāchalam pangum langhayate girim jatkripatamaham vande Shri Gurun Dinataranam. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupakadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Pancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhobhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Oh, Hare Krishna. I would apologize for last week, but it's too embarrassing. So I just hope everyone will have forgiven me by now. Today I want to discuss a little bit from chapter 5 of the Bhagavad-Gita. And I want to focus on what we see, especially in the first 13 verses today. And there are probably a couple of themes that I'm likely to hit on, to focus on. Well, one broad theme, I think, and that is the attitude. I mean, we see that in Krishna's instructions to Arjuna here at the beginning of the 5th chapter, and also at the end of the 4th chapter. I mean, as Tripurari Maharaj points out, at the end of the 2nd chapter, Krishna summarizes that state of samadhi that he's encouraging Arjuna to actually live in. And then in the 3rd chapter, he argues that Arjuna should do his duty on the basis of the importance of sacrifice. He talks a lot about sacrifice, and Srila Prabhupada ultimately, because there's some discussion of foodstuffs in the discussion of sacrifice, Srila Prabhupada says ultimately that means we should offer our food to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We should actually only eat remnants of those foods that have been offered to the Lord. And in the 4th chapter, he goes a little deeper, I think, by bringing transcendental knowledge into the picture. And he tells Arjuna, that you should cultivate the kind of knowledge that will, that will help you live in this state of samadhi that I described earlier. And then in the 5th chapter, he begins by clarifying just what he means, what might seem a little equivocal at the end of the 4th chapter. So we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. But first, I want to review these verses at the end of chapter 2 that describe samadhi. So we're starting with text 55. The Lord of Sri said, O Partha, one who, having renounced all desires born of the mind, is satisfied in the self and by the self, is said to be one whose insight is steady. Amid suffering and happiness, his mind is neither deluded nor delighted. He who is free from desire and whose passion, fear, and anger have subsided is said to be a stage of steady mind. One who's free from all material affection, who upon attaining that which is pleasant or unpleasant, neither praises nor disapproves, stands firm in wisdom. One embodied may fast from feeding the senses, turning away from their objects, but the taste for the objects remains. However, one who does the same in the course of experiencing a higher taste derived from seeing God loses the very taste for sense objects as well. These are themes that we see throughout the Bhagavad-Gita, and we see them throughout Srimad Bhagavatam as well. Anyway, I'll keep moving. O son of Kunti, the senses are so strong. Did I skip one? Yes, I did. Oh, so we see this freedom from material affection. We want to be, Yoga Sutras tell us that yoga means stilling the agitation of the chitta, the internal body, the antakarana, by withdrawing the senses and fixing them on the Lord ultimately. But we should, we learn from the Gita and from the Bhagavatam that we should neither lament on attaining something not so much to our liking, nor get too carried away by joy if something happens to work out right. These things are all coming and going. As I sometimes point out, Krishna summarizes our whole material experience throughout, maybe God only knows how many lifetimes, in 2 words in the Gita, Hukalayam Masashvatam. There's suffering and it's temporary. So in a sense, there's some consolation there built in, because even the suffering is temporary, but we also should know, always keep in mind that whatever pleasure we're experiencing is also fleeting. It's gone in the blink of an eye. So Krishna is admonishing Arjuna here to actually become fixed in mind, not to be chasing the mind all over the place. And when he completely withdraws his senses from his objects, as a tortoise withdraws its limbs within its shell, his wisdom stands firm. One body may fast from feeding the senses, turning away from their objects, but the taste for those objects remains. However, one who does the same in the course of experiencing a higher taste derived from seeing God loses the very taste for sense objects as well. And we see that especially throughout the Bhagavatam. One example, of course, is Dhruva Maharaj. Dhruva Maharaj had a big material desire. He wanted a kingdom greater than his great-grandfather's. Great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather? Can't remember which right now. Maybe great-great-grandfather, Lord Brahma, which is the whole universe. But Dhruva, being childish, wanted something more. So he approached the Lord with his big material desire in mind. But what he got instead, by the Lord's grace, is direct vision of the Lord, direct perception of the Lord, which is what we hope to attain when we engage in bhakti yoga. And Dhruva was certainly engaged in bhakti yoga. He had been instructed by Narada Muni, and he engaged in austerities, which culminated in his taking a breath every other day, I think, and chanting Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya and meditating on this beautiful form of the Lord that Narada Muni described to him. And we see such descriptions also throughout the Bhagavatam of the form of the Lord that we might meditate on. And there's also a description in the 11th canto when the Lord's describing the yoga process and the whole. But Dhruva's experience was that on attaining darshan of the Lord, whatever it is he wanted evaporated. So in the Bhagavatam, Dhruva says, when he sees the Lord, he offers prayers, And early in the prayers, he says, I'm like a poor man who, on approaching the king, could have asked for anything, could have asked for half the kingdom, but instead asked for a bag of rice. And I think, well, I can't remember which text now, but in another text that we see cited in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, and which Srila Prabhupada cited more than the Bhagavatam verse, says, it's as if I was looking for pieces of broken glass, and I found the most valuable gem. So we see this throughout the Bhagavatam, and in the 11th canto, early in the 11th canto, one of the Navayogendras, I think Kavi or Havi, tells King Nimi just how we can measure whether or not we're making, whether we can have some sense at least, whether we're making progress in our bhakti. He says, Bhakti Pareshano Bhavo Viraktiranyatra anyway, there we go. This is a verse I thought I used to know. Bhakti Pareshano Bhavo Viraktiranyatra. Three things happen simultaneously and progressively as we engage in bhakti. That bhakti, that service sense, that service attitude, Bhakti Padeshano Bhavo, some direct experience of the Lord, and consequently, Viraktiranyatracha, becoming detached from everything else. When we get bhakti, when we have some direct experience of the Lord, and everything else pales by comparison. At the best, pales by comparison. They practically disappear by comparison with serving the Lord. Narada Muni tells Vyasadeva in the first canto that even if we engage in our varnashram duties perfectly, the benefits that we get from them are temporary. Whereas we don't have to engage in bhakti perfectly. We don't have to get it all right off the bat, because nothing's ever going to be lost. Krishna gives that assurance in the Gita, and we see that same assurance throughout the Bhagavatam. So, so the sage tells King Nimi, so Narada Muni tells Vyasadeva that even if someone gives up their practice, even if they seem to fall by the wayside for one reason or another, still there isn't anything lost, because they're always going to be remembering that taste they got by serving the lotus feet of the Lord. Rasagraha is the word that's used in that verse. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur tells us Rasagraha means haunted. Graha means haunted, as if by a ghost we can't shake. So when we have that experience, then the hankering for other things, other much less significant things, naturally decreases. And the sage compares this to eating a meal. How do we know if we're eating a meal? Well, three things happen simultaneously and progressively as we eat. Tushti, pushti, kshudapaya. Pleasure, nourishment, and consequently, relief from hunger. So these three things happen naturally as we eat. And so the other three things, the bhakti pareshano bhava virakti anyatracha, those things also happen progressively as we engage in our bhakti. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur tells us in his commentary on the first canto verse, where Vyasadeva, this is 1.5.19, where Vyasadeva Narada Muni assures Vyasadeva that even if someone falls away from their practice, they'll always remember the lotus feet of the Lord, and they'll always come back. And in his commentary, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, well, maybe if we say rasagraha, it sounds like something really advanced, like at least asakti or bhava, But he says, no, actually, this begins from the very first day of worshiping the Lord. And he cites this 11th canto verse as his support. And in his commentary on that 11th canto verse, he says that, he points out where the analogy breaks down. And that is that you can't keep eating forever. You can't just eat constantly, more and more. At a certain point, you're going to become satiated. You're going to become full and lose interest in eating. But that doesn't happen when we engage in bhakti. When we engage in bhakti, we get more and more taste. And so we can always eat. So he points out that there where the analogy breaks down. Krishna continues at the end of the second chapter. Restraining the senses and disciplining oneself, one should sit fixing one's consciousness on me. Such a person is known to be steady in wisdom. When one contemplates the sense objects, attachment for them is born. From attachment, desire is born. From desire, frustration. And from frustration, delusion. When one is deluded, memory is lost. With the loss of memory, power of discrimination is destroyed. With the destruction of discrimination, one's own self is lost. However, even while moving among sense objects, the self-controlled one who is free from attachment and aversion, bringing his self under the jurisdiction of God, attains God's grace. For the pure-minded, all suffering ceases. Without a doubt, he who has attained purity of mind soon develops steadfast intelligence. Unless one is disciplined in yoga, one cannot have clear intelligence. Unless one is so disciplined, one cannot engage in meditation. Without meditation, there's no peace. And how can one have happiness without peace? Whichever of the roving senses the mind runs after, that sense carries away one's intelligence, just as the wind carries away a ship on the ocean, a ship on water. Therefore, O mighty armed one who completely withdraws the senses from sense objects is fixed in wisdom. That which is night for all sentient beings is like day for one whose senses are controlled. That which is the time of awakening for a sentient being is night for the introspective sage who sees. As the ocean remains still, even while rivers enter into it, he who remains unmoved in spite of all desires attains peace, not he who strives to fulfill such desires. We see in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Krishna Bhakti Nishkama Ataiva Shanta, Bhukti Mukti Siddhi Kama, Sakaliya Shanta, that those who maintain a desire, who pursue Bhukti Mukti Siddhi, the enjoyment of the senses, the yogic siddhis, or even liberation, because as the Bhagavatam rejects these all as selfish desires, they're all cheating dharma. So one who is a Krishna Bhakta he's not worried about these things. He's not always chasing after pleasure or some kind of perfection, yogic perfection, or even liberation. So they're peaceful. Their chitta is settled. Their intelligence is clear. A person who has abandoned all desires for sense indulgence acts free from desire, indifferent to proprietorship and free from egotism. He attains peace. O Partha, having attained this divine state, one is not deluded. If one is fixed in this consciousness, even at the moment of death, one attains Brahman and the cessation of all suffering. So then we see at the end of the fourth chapter, Krishna is telling Arjuna, again, you should try to be peaceful. You should try to acquire transcendental knowledge by inquiring from those who have it and serving them. And you should be fixed in this knowledge and peaceful. So he says, one who's renounced action through yoga and whose doubt is cut asunder by knowledge and is thus composed in his self, O Dhananjaya, is not bound by karma. Therefore, having cut away with the sword of knowledge your doubt arising from ignorance that lurks in your heart, take refuge in yoga and stand for battle. Now, what an interesting sentence. Take refuge in yoga and stand for battle. So Tripurari Maharaj points out that this sounds like a contradiction, but Krishna is actually not contradicting himself. So we begin the 5th chapter with Arjuna questioning him about this apparently equivocal instruction. O Krishna, on the one hand, you advocate renunciation of action, and on the other, you advocate yoga. Tell me with certainty which of the two is better. The Lord said, both renunciation of action and selfless action lead to ultimate happiness. However, of the two, selfish action is better than the renunciation of action. A person who's freed from both hatred and desire is always renounced. Being indifferent to dualities, O mighty armed, he's easily freed from bondage and attains liberation. Childish persons, not the learned, declare that contemplative life and selfless action are separate. One who practices either of these correctly achieves the same result. So here Krishna is telling us that these aren't really two completely discrete paths, completely distinct paths. Instead, because the ultimate attainment is the same, they're really the same. And for many people, he's saying that selfless action is going to be better, because who can really renounce, who can really become detached from material pursuits, especially if they haven't yet attained spiritual realization. If we haven't attained spiritual realization, then the objects of sense desire are always going to be calling. And we'll hear those call, and we have to work hard to ignore them. And that's the business of the yogi, to train the mind. To train the mind to remain calm when external forces or even internal forces seem to act on them. So what we see is the oneness of these apparently different endeavors, but that Krishna is asserting that one is more appropriate. This renunciation is appropriate for people who actually have some spiritual attainment. But that other people are actually better served by engaging in selfless action. Because if we don't have control over our senses, then we're always going to be disturbed we're going to find ourselves in this cascade of desire that we saw described back in the 2nd chapter when contemplating sense objects. Then we end up losing our very self, even if it happens in stages. So Krishna is telling Arjuna, he says, someone who practices either of these paths correctly is going to achieve the same result. And he continues, that destination attained by contemplatives is also attained by the yogis. Contemplative life and karma yoga are one. One who perceives this sees things as they are. However, renunciation of action without yoga, O Arjuna, is difficult. The sage who is practiced in yoga, however, quickly attains the absolute. Engaged in yoga, one whose intelligence is purified, mind controlled, whose senses are conquered, and who's thus identified with the self of all beings, is not implicated even while acting. So what we see is that either by meditation or by selfless action, what we want to attain in order to actually be happy, in order to actually be free, is this oneness with all living beings, being able to sense our identity with every other living entity. In order to do that, we need to identify as Brahman, as consciousness. And so that takes some work. So Krishna, one of the things that Krishna is addressing here is different kinds of eligibility. So we see in the first chapter, Arjuna has proposed, because he can't contemplate going to war with those who are so close to him, those to whom he's so attached. And as we know, when Arjuna asked Krishna to draw the chariot up between the two armies, Krishna positioned the chariot particularly in front of grandfather Bhishma and Dronacharya, to whom Arjuna was very attached, naturally. His teacher, his great uncle, who served as a grandfather, actually raised both sets of cousins. So Arjuna's proposed that on the basis of a few things. One is protection of society. Another is enjoyment. Another is he gives several reasons for desisting from fighting, and he proposes instead that it might be better for him to go to the forest and just be a yogi. So Krishna's told him back in the beginning of the second chapter, this all sounds very dharmic, but under the circumstances in this context, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And you should kind of rethink your position here, rethink your situation. And he's telling him just how he should reconsider his situation. So Arjuna is proposing going to the forest or going to live in a cave yoga, but Krishna is countering with yoga in the world. He's telling him this selfless action, this is also yoga, karma yoga. If you do it with the right attitude, if you do it with an intention of serving the greater good, serving something beyond your own senses, especially for serving the Supreme Lord and any ends that he might have, then that's yoga as well. And you're gonna get the same result. You're gonna find yourself immersed in me. Just as he says in the middle of the Gita and again at the end of the Gita, he says, everything should be about me. Your mind should be engaged always in thinking of me. Become my devotee. Devote your life to my service. Madhyaji mam namaskuru. Your worship should be for me. Your obeisances, your obedience, that should be for me. In other words, he's saying, just love me, because we know that when we love someone, we're all about whatever their needs are. Our minds are always thinking about them. We want to do whatever they need to be done. And so this is love. Love means action. Srila Prabhupada consistently translates the word bhakti as devotional service. And we know that that's proper because we see the definition of bhakti, uttama bhakti, Shuddha Bhakti, pure devotional service, at the beginning of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Anyabhilashita Shunyam Jnana Karmadyanavritam. So there's your Tatastha Lakshana, your marginal part of the definition, which is basically what it's not. It means having given up the pursuit of Jnana Karma Adi, everything else. And Anyabhilashita Shunyam Jnana Karmadyanavritam Anukulyena Krishnanushilanam Bhakti Ruttama. So bhakti means real bhakti, pure bhakti, the bhakti that we're going to talk about in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. That means having forsaken all other goals, just as we see at the end of the Bhagavad-Gita, give up all your conventional ideas of dharma. And then in even starker language, the next step at the beginning of the Bhagavatam, Dharma projita koitavotra paramo niramat saranam satam. That if you completely reject, once we've completely rejected all kinds of, here he doesn't just call them conventional dharmas, he calls them cheating dharmas. And Krishnadas Kaviraj explains what we mean when we say kaitava dharma in that verse. He explains this verse in the 22nd chapter of Madhya Lila, the chapter in which the Lord talks about Sharanagati and the 64 angas of sadhana bhakti. Krishnadas Kaviraj says, what do we mean by kaitava dharma? Dharma, artha, kama, moksha, vancha. Oh, but wait, that's everything. That's all four of the Purusharthas, all four of the great values of human life, the four things that we're meant to try to attain as human beings. Virtue, attain virtue so that we can make material progress, so that we can enjoy, and then once we've seen through the whole scam, become free, become liberated. So Krishnadas Kaviraj condemns all these aspirations. The Bhagavatam condemns all these aspirations as cheating religion. Why cheating religion? Why cheating dharma? Because they're about me. It's about my virtue, so that I can get ahead in the world, so I can enjoy, and then ultimately so I can become free from all this foolishness. So this is what Krishna is ultimately advocating. We see Krishna will argue as we move through the Gita. Krishna will argue from so many angles of vision, but ultimately where he comes is manmanabhava madbhakta. Just love me. How do we do that practically? Sarvadharman parityajya mamekam shara. Take exclusive shelter in me, having given up all other pursuits, all other senses of dharma, completely parityaja, completely rejected them, just as we see praujita at the beginning of the Bhagavatam. So what Krishna is addressing here is eligibility. He's telling Arjuna, look, you're a kshatriya, you're a warrior, you're a prince. This is your duty. This is where you're at, and you need to behave accordingly. There are a couple of lines in Sanskrit that are cited twice in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was apparently quite fond of this verse because he cited it fairly frequently. So the first line, Sve Svedikariya Nishta Saguna Parikirtita. It means Sve Svedikariya Nishta, being fixed in your own situation, in understanding your adhikar and behaving accordingly. Saguna Parikirtita. This is declared to be virtue. This is good character. And he says to do otherwise is a fault. viparyayas tudosha syat. Doing otherwise is just a fault. In other words, not acting according to where we are, not understanding where we actually are, and therefore not behaving according to our actual qualification, that's a fault. So that could mean a couple of things. One is that if we're eligible, say we're eligible for jnana, but we're still pursuing sense gratification, we have some understanding, some spiritual understanding, and we actually could spend our lives meditating, but we still go chasing after sense objects. That's a fault. And if we're eligible for bhakti, and there's one place in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu where even after having discussed the eligibility for sadhana bhakti, Rupa Goswami says, everyone is eligible for bhakti. Because that's what we're meant for. So our Krishna, so if we're eligible for bhakti, but we simply engage in jnana, cultivating jnana or meditation for some mystic perfection, or for seeing the super soul, or for merging with the Lord, or by becoming liberated by becoming one with the Lord, that's also a fault. For those who are in those places, for those who really aren't eligible for jnana, they're so distracted by their attraction to sense objects that they couldn't possibly sit down and meditate. Can't meditate the way that we're enjoined to meditate by Patanjali, by Lord Sri Krishna himself in the Bhagavad-Gita. One of the devotees whom I've had three newer devotees here, all not initiated, but smart, sincere, dedicated devotees giving Bhagavad Gita classes. We began at the beginning of April, and we're in the second chapter of the Gita now. And one of the devotees who gave class, I think it was last week, made the point that nowadays, we think, okay, I'm going to sit in the corner of my living room and meditate for 7 minutes in the morning, and then that will enable me to conquer the world. She says, but the actual yogis, they're thinking, I'm going to sit down and meditate for hours and hours a day for 10,000 years, and eventually that may help me conquer my senses and my mind. Big, big difference. So Krishna's advising Arjuna, this is your situation. You're a warrior. You're a prince. You're not a sage. You're not a brahmana. If you try to go to the forest to meditate, it's going to be a failure. It's not going to work out well for you. And then, on top of that, everybody's going to make fun of you. They're going to say bad things about you because you ran away from battle. They're going to say that you were afraid to fight, even though we know that's not true. This is how people are in this world. So a real virtue would be to understand where you actually are, and behaving accordingly. So, and then as bhaktas, of course, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes a couple of interesting points. He says, one thing is not to see faults in devotees, and to be very careful about finding out the good qualities of the devotees and broadcasting those. But then he also says that we should understand that karma and jnana, they don't give their own results. So we can see the fault in the practice of a jnani if they don't bring in some bhakti, because without bhakti, there's no success in yoga, and there's no success in meditation, and there's not even success in material, increasing material pleasure. Just just doesn't happen. There has to be some devotion. I mean, there has to be at least enough devotion, maybe not pure bhakti. It's certainly not going to be pure bhakti, because we're admonished as much as possible to background those all the desires that might get in the way of the bhakti. But we want to understand what's favorable for bhakti and what's not, and that's what we see as we move through the 5th chapter here. But so here Krishna is telling Arjuna, here's the thing: you're not a sage, you're not a yogi, you're not even a brahmana, you're a prince. And here we have a big political problem, and the prince's job is to solve political problems. And when it comes to a head like this, when it's completely when it's proven completely impossible to resolve reasonably, and goodness knows great efforts were made to resolve this particular political problem. When that's not possible, then the Kshatriya has to protect his praja, those who depend on him, from harm. Chayate means stopping harm, right? So Krishna's, on one level at least, reminding Arjuna, this is where you're at, and this is one way to look at this. That you'll actually attain perfection if you bring the right attitude, this attitude of detachment, and we're going to see that a little more in subsequent verses. If you bring that attitude of detachment to your action, there isn't any sin incurred. If it's dedicated for a higher cause, especially for the ultimate cause, me, then there should be no problem. So then Krishna continues. However, renunciation of action without yoga is difficult. The sage whose practice in yoga quickly attains the absolute. Engaged in yoga, one whose intelligence is purified, whose mind is controlled, whose senses are conquered, and who's thus identified with the self of all beings, is not implicated even when acting. So if we understand ourselves as consciousness, and as consciousness, identical, substantively anyway, with every other entity, we see everything in Krishna and Krishna in everything, then we don't become implicated by those activities. A person who is steadfast in yoga and who knows things as they are should think, I am not doing anything, even while I'm seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, walking, sleeping, breathing, talking, evacuating, accepting things, blinking my eyes. Rather, it is the senses alone that are acting in relation to these objects. So Triparamash points out that this verse builds on verse 28 in chapter 3, which we can take a quick look at. About it. Tattva vittu mahabaho gunakarma vibhagayo guna guneshu vartanta iti matvasana sajjate. However, Almighty Armed One who knows the truth concerning the two spheres, action and the gunas, and thus thinks that only the gunas interact with one another, remains unattached. So Krishna is pointing out in that verse, in the 3rd chapter, that if we actually see things as they are, we can remain detached from our action. We can do what needs to be done without attachment for the results. It's not about me. I'm doing this for the object of my mercy, or perhaps the object of my duty, or even better, the object of my love, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, so this, this builds on this. We see that it's not the activity per se that defines the actor, but it's the consciousness that the actor brings to that. Just as we see in Sri Chaitanya Bhagavata, Krishna is Bhavagrahi Janardana, right? It's the intention, the attitude that we bring to the activity that defines the quality of that activity and defines the actor as well. So, oh gosh, what was I just saying? Trying to remember what verse I was just thinking of. So, so in Sri Chaitanya Bhagavat, there's a verse that says, so a foolish person may say Om Vishnaya Namaha when he means to say Om Vishnave Namaha. It doesn't matter because Krishna is Bhavagrahi Janardana, because he's the source of all living beings. All living beings rest in him. He sees their hearts. He sees their intention. He accepts their intention. Whatever bhava, whatever affection they bring to that, that's what he reciprocates with. Just as Krishna says toward the end of the 9th canto, and also in the Bhagavatam as well. There's an identical verse in the Bhagavatam. Patram pushpam palang toyam yome bhakta prayachati. He says, if you offer me even something as simple as a leaf, a flower, fruit, or some water, I accept that. If it's mixed with bhakti, if the offering is mixed with bhakti, if there's some bhakti there, I accept that. Because what we say, sometimes we say, what do you give to the person who has everything? The one thing they don't have, my heart. And if we can do that, well, then we've attained the goal of bhakti yoga, which is the sense, and this is particularly evident in the stage of prema, that I am Krishna's and Krishna is mine. The problem of ahanta and mamata that we see posed in the very first verse of the Bhagavad-Gita, mamaka pandavascha, right? Dhritarashtra should know better. You'd think he would know better, but still, even though we've done all these things to try to avert this war, still he holds, because of the influence of Duryodhana, especially, he holds on to this us and them mentality, mamaka pandavascha. But if we don't see us and them, if we see this sense of identity, then we can act with detachment. So Krishna continues. One who works without attachment, describing his actions to Brahman, is not tainted by evil, just as a lotus leaf is untouched by water. So now he's adding another element here. But first, we should understand that it's not I who is chasing these sense objects. It's the senses interacting with their objects, driven by my corrupted mind. So then he says, even better is to understand that everything is directed by Brahman. Everything is directed by the absolute truth. Then we certainly can become detached. Our behavior isn't tainted by evil any more than a lotus flower gets wet because a drop of water has fallen on it. Because of the way the lotus leaf is made up and the lotus petals as well, the water stands on the lotus leaf, beat it up, doesn't actually touch the lotus leaf. So it's the detachment, the sense of detachment, and how we'll see in the 5th chapter how to develop that detachment. So Krishna continues, Karma yogis act with the body, mind, intellect, and even the senses solely for the purpose of purification, having renounced attachment. A person disciplined in karma yoga, having renounced the fruit of action, I apologize. I don't know what happened there, but I suddenly lost my connection and couldn't get back on for a couple of minutes, and I don't know what that was about. I've got a what do you call it? A LAN and Wi-Fi, so I don't know how it is that I lost my good Wi-Fi. Router's right next door, so I don't know how it is I lost my connection, and consequently, I also lost my train of thought. Trying to take care of all that. Oh, so we were anyway. More broadly, I was talking about this attitude of detachment, that it's not I that's doing these things. It's my senses in the my senses interacting with their objects, or it's the influence of the Supreme Lord. So in the 13th, oh, excuse me, the clock must be ticking here because my voice is also failing. So in the 13th verse, Krishna says, mentally renouncing all actions, the embodied one happily resides with self-control within the city of nine gates, neither acting nor causing action to be performed. If the detachment is actually there, then there isn't any implication in karma. If just as, well, here we have Arjuna is a soldier, and he is being enjoined by Krishna to fight. And so we know that when we're in, when we serve in the military, that because we're supposed to be doing this for a higher cause, for something bigger than ourselves, engaged in fighting, that it's not sinful. Now, because most of us aren't warriors by nature, we may find war traumatic. The killing, the destruction, or the seeing other people injured and killed causes a trauma, causes emotional trauma, along with any physical trauma that we might experience in war. And the emotional trauma is very hard to deal with. I mean, we still, what is it we hear? I think it's still something like 22 veterans every day take their own lives because of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And but Krishna is telling Arjuna, this is a righteous fight. This is my fight. This fight I've ordained. And if you want to be peaceful, if you actually want to be happy, if you actually want the reputation that you said earlier, you want to be a good person, then you're going to step up, do your duty as a warrior, face your duty as a warrior. Look it in the eye, just as I've had you look Bhishma and Drona in the eye. Because as we see, what Krishna is telling Arjuna right off the bat, your business here is killing your closest attachments. And your business will be successful. Your life will be peaceful if you can successfully detach yourself from all those things that you're accustomed to being attached to. So here, Krishna's setting Arjuna up for further discussion of just how to behave in the world without attachment. Okay, so we've come to the bottom of the hour, and I'm going to stop here and see if there is any further discussion from anyone else. So we have a very intimate audience today, so we can say anything we want. Nobody's listening. It's just us. Except it's also on Facebook, which means it's forever.
Dandavats Maharaj.
Dandavats.
You mentioned what Sri Vishwanath said about the difference between eating and engaging in bhakti, and it is that you become satiated by eating. And I thought of this anecdote that is told sometimes about Srila Sridhar Maharaj, how the devotees were listening to him and the talk was over, and they all said, "We feel completely satisfied." And he was saying, "Oh, is that possible?" So I was wondering if you can comment on this in relation to the Bhakti Paresh Anubhavo verse.
Yeah. What we lose our appetite for is everything other than bhakti. Viraktiranyatra. So just as when we're eating, we lose our appetite becomes sated, and we don't need to eat anymore. But what we lose our appetite for when we're engaged in bhakti is everything that's non-bhakti. Viraktiranyatra, everything else. So what Srila Sridhar Maharaj was implying that, well, if the discourse was successful, then you should be hankering for yet more. How can you be satisfied? How can you be full? This should actually whet your appetite, sharpen your appetite for even more harikatha. Tushyanti charamanti cha. This is where devotees find their satisfaction and their pleasure. But so he might have been reading that we're completely satisfied as we're full. But wait, no, we have more courses to serve, and I think you'll like them as well. So I think he may have had something like that in mind with when he made that remark. Oh, we're completely satisfied. We're perfectly satisfied. Oh, is it possible? That would be my take on that.
Thank you.
As it was presented to me. We should be always eager for more. Yesterday, I had breakfast with two old friends of mine. Friends of many of the devotees in the Sangha, Drishta and Rudrani, who were visiting their daughter here in Honolulu. She just had her daughter the other day, their first grandchild, and we were sitting with them and another devotee, and somehow or other we just got into talking about Bhagavatam verses, different Bhagavatam verses and different chapters of the Bhagavatam and the pleasures that we found there. And then at the end, we just all looked at each other and said, wow, now that was a good breakfast. And we weren't done, but we felt, that we had given the day a good start, along with the rest of our sadhana, that we had sat with devotees and engaged in this wonderful harikatha, even though not deliberately. It's not that we thought, oh, I'm going to sit down and I'm only going to talk about Krishna. It just happened because of good company. So we'll always be hungry for more. Let me see. Where's my iPad? Find just what Vishwanath says in his Tika there. Okay, go right back. It's just the way he says it is just so nice. Pardon me, please. I'm much better at navigating analog books than I am at digital books. I'm still not good at this. So he says, it's really nice the way he says this. Similarly, for a person who eats, there is happiness, nourishment, and disappearance of hunger with each mouthful. As one takes a mouthful of rice, this happens. Just as a person who eats a little gets a little satisfaction, a little nourishment, and a little relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord a little with hearing and chanting gets a little experience of the Lord and a little detachment from material life. And just as a person who eats a lot gets full satisfaction, full nourishment, and full relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord fully experiences the Lord fully and becomes completely detached from material life. But though it is impossible to keep eating, by more worship of the Lord, one becomes more capable of worshiping. That is the difference. So it's just really sweet.
Thank you. It's perfect.
Thank you. Anything else before we adjourn for the week? Okay, as usual, I want to thank Padmanabha Maharaj for engaging me like this. It's a bit of a pinch because it's early morning for me. It's directly after Mangalarti, and it's a time when I would usually be chanting japa and engaged in serving my deities. So I have to reorganize my morning. So it's a bit of a pinch, but I think that's what makes it good for me. Guru Maharaj sometimes says, if you give and it doesn't pinch a little bit, then we need to stretch just a little bit. So this stretches me, and it's not a hardship actually because of such good company. And I'm grateful to Sakyarati and Shamananda for agreeing to host, because I'm old and a little inept technologically, not terribly, but I don't have all this stuff figured out. And to the devotees who came to encourage me to engage in this. I'm very grateful to all of you. And I'll see you again. I will see you again next week. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Sripad Bhakti Abhay Ashram Maharaj ki
Jai.
jai.
Bhaktivinoda ki jai.